Hello, I'm Robert Ellsberg. I'm the publisher of Orbis books, and I'm here with two new authors, Frank Fromherz and Sister Suzanne Sattler, to talk about their new book, No Guilty Bystander, The Extraordinary Life of Bishop Thomas Gumbleton. And it truly is an extraordinary life. He's now, I believe, 93 years old, the retired auxiliary bishop of Detroit. He was appointed to that position in 1968 at a time when he was, I think, one of the youngest, if not the youngest, bishop of the United States. And he never left that role as an auxiliary bishop of Detroit. And there are reasons for that because of choices that he made early on about whether his ambition was to be a successful man of the church, or really to be a disciple of Jesus and a witness to the gospel in the world. And he chose that route. And that's the story that is more or less documented in this amazing book that goes from his childhood all the way up to his present, all the way up to the present. Now, the title No Guilty Bystander is a little play on a title of a book by Thomas Merton, isn't it? And maybe you could explain your thinking in choosing that title for this biography.
Well, I will begin by just thanking you, Robert. And of course, with Sue Sattler, we're really thinking about the significant influence that Thomas Merton has had on so many people ever since time of his life and his writings. And we know from the research into the life of Tom Gumbleton that profound influence Merton had on Tom Gumbleton. In particular, there's a book called Conjectures of a Guilty Bystander. Mm-hmm. And it's clear that Merton thought of himself as a kind of guilty bystander, although quickly we realized he really wasn't. Through his writing especially, he engaged the world, especially in the latter part of his life. And it was clear to us that the record shows Tom Gumbleton is no guilty bystander. So there you go.
Well, you begin in the beginning, with his early life, growing up in Detroit and going to Catholic schools and then into seminary. And he's ordained as a priest. He goes to Rome for studies. And so he becomes a bishop in 1968, right? And this is in the middle of the height of the Vietnam War. And right from the beginning, that kind of posed a challenge that, as you kind of described, in a way defined the choices that he was going to make and the response that he made. Maybe you could talk a little bit about what happened there.
I'll jump in with this particular point, but I'm sure Sue has a lot to elaborate on this question. As you know, we opened the book with that turning point experience of Tom really being challenged by activist priests and people in religious life, certainly challenging him. This is even before he's the bishop. Probably we think that, as far as we can tell, and you know how research can be, you're trying to be best you can, but we think it was in late 65, after Lyndon Baines Johnson had really radically increased the true presence in Southeast Asia. And the activists were out there in the community all over the country. We think of the Americans and others beginning to move, but certainly right there in Detroit. And they sat down with Tom. Tom actually was sent to speak with them, Bishop Gumbleton, at that point, not a bishop, but in a lead role in the archdiocese, to kind of ask him to cool it, these activist priests in particular. They challenged him, and he set up and took notice and began to really delve into rethinking the entire just war training, which he really had never paid he admitted he didn't pay close attention to in his seminary training. So he began to really explore that. And then there were many other influences. Sue, why don't you jump in on this one a little?
Well, I certainly agree with what you said. And I think this pattern of his listening to people, even though in this case he did have a charge to change their minds, and the opposite happened, but his pattern of listening to people, whether he met them through someone requesting help or someone saying, would you come and speak to this group or whatever. His pattern of listening to people really and identifying with their needs when that they were present, that is what transformed Tom Gumbleton throughout his life. I met him in 68 and I observed it. By the early 70s, I was saying, I have a lot to learn from this guy because he lets his experience, he enters into experiences that many priests at that time wouldn't. And then he engages with how it affects him in the light of his ministry and the gospel. So it's a pattern.
I was very moved by the way that, as you say, he listens to people and is capable of learning, and then sometimes surpasses the people he's listening to, but keeps on going deeper and deeper. And he doesn't stop to think, well, is this going to affect my reputation, or is this going to interfere with my career? A lot of auxiliary bishops are dreaming of when they're going to become a bishop or archbishop or whatever. And he never had that kind of ambition for anything personal, as far as I can tell. It was always about accompanying people and listening to the deep moral questions of people who were trying to engage with how to really live out the gospel. So in terms of first kind of coming into opposition to the Vietnam War, he goes deeper into the logic of nonviolence. And that becomes one of the defining features of his whole ministry, isn't it?
If I may just say on this, even though Frank is the expert on the whole section on the Vietnam War, what I remember at the time was he was soon inundated by men dealing with the question of conscientious objection. They kept coming. He would either by phone or letter or visit. And I remember his saying at the time, I have to study this more. I have to learn more about it. He was inspired by their seriousness and their intent. And that indeed was one of the earliest maybe in public policy transformation.
Yeah, and I completely agree with that observations, Sue. The thread of conscience and Tom's particular grappling with very much, by the way, and we both know this so well, studying his life, and Sue in particular, knowing him for so many years, as you mentioned, since the late 60s there in Detroit. A person that really would take an idea, a moral argument, whatever it might be. Again, I mentioned the just war tradition, and as you pointed out, Robert, his moving forward through, particularly as he engaged with a couple of other bishops and certainly a lot of grassroots folks in the community in the forming of Pax Christi USA, and that whole movement into Pax Christi. That his story and the story of Pax Christi, the last 50 plus years now, are deeply interwoven, and that spirit of the peace of Christ, the Pax Christi, the commitment to a Catholic vision of nonviolence that we see now in the Catholic Nonviolence Initiative with Marie Dennis, with Pope Francis, even the question of trying to address what's going on in the horror in Ukraine as we speak, and other places in the world, try to address a nonviolent alternative to war. This is central to Tom. What's central is that he grapples in a very personal, interpersonal, as you say, Sue, responding to the conscientious voices of these young draftees grappling with whether or not they should serve and looking for backing from somebody in the church. He grapples with it in a very personal way. So people that study conscience professionally as a field, I think would find his case study remarkable to understand how this idea of personal conscience and communal conscience intersect. Remarkable story.
Yeah, it's important to remember that, as you described how he was really part of forming, this modern kind of Catholic peace movement in the United States. There had been people like Dorothy Day, obviously, and Thomas Merton writing about this in the 60s, and the Barragans who came out of that in resistance to the Vietnam War. But with Pax Christi, there were a number of bishops at that time who were supportive and sympathetic, and bringing this kind of gospel message of peace to the closer to the center. We could jump ahead 50 years to see how the seeds of that message have blossomed in the church, if not so much in the United States, where there are probably fewer bishops supporting Pax Christi than there were back then.
Yeah.
But with Pope Francis. But I don't want to jump ahead that far. I want to jump ahead a little bit now to, when Bishop Gumbleton is actually an influential voice within the bishops' conference, such that he's invited to be part of the committee that devises a pastoral letter for the bishops on war and peace. Where is that in their early 80s, 79, 80, 81, something
Came
like
out in
that?
83. So
Came out, but it was a long
Well,
process.
2-year
of doing
process
it,
plus, I think.
And they deliberately, it was kind of, I guess was it Cardinal Bernardine, I guess, was put in charge. He's not a cardinal at that point, Archbishop, I guess.
At the time, the Archbishop of Cincinnati.
Cincinnati, and he had this kind of team of bishops that spanned the spectrum from John O'Connor, who was the Vicar General of the Armed Forces, and then you had Tom Gumbleton as the pacifist on the team.
Right.
And even though he was not in the mainstream, he actually had a tremendous influence and impact in shaping that document, didn't he? Maybe talk a little bit about that.
Okay, well, one thing we could say about that is, as you're noting in each of these questions and themes we're discussing, these are all, of course, explored in various chapters in the book. And one in particular we actually call Taking Up the Challenge of Peace, a kind of play off the name of the U.S. Bishop's pastoral letter that, as Sue indicated, was issued in May of 1983. So here we are actually 40 years after the issuing of that pastoral letter as we speak right now. And the power of that letter, many would say, is a really deep grappling with the criteria of the just war tradition, very specifically, but finding that criteria, those criteria, inadequate in the face of the profound realities of the nuclear age, the whole question of deterrence, nuclear deterrence. Tom Gumbleton's in a meeting with then Defense Secretary Caspar Weinberger, with other members of the committee. And, he asked Caspar Weinberger, this is Ronald Reagan's defense secretary in the very early 80s, about the question of nuclear deterrence. What does that really mean? And, is that simply a threat? You would never use them? And Caspar Weinberger is very straightforward. He's not in any way deceptive. He says, look, of course we don't want to use them, but if we have to, we will. That just bowled Tom over, it shocked him, hit him right at the core. And you don't necessarily feel that level of the reality. Frankly, I studied the Peace Pastoral Letter for my doctoral work in Berkeley many years ago and analyzed it. The individual voice, the sort of counsel of a Gandhi, of Jesus Christ himself, of all the examples we have of, a strong commitment to nonviolence, they're held up in the pastoral letter as kind of examples of heroic individual. But the bishops tend to land kind of the defense of the common good requires the just war tradition. But on the question of deterrence, they really end up in a very nuanced place. Tom was central to engaging that nuance with all the bishops, with J. Brian Hare, the very influential Catholic thinker, kind of the John Courtney Murray of the more recent time frame, Christian realist. Remarkable stuff in there. Sue, you have much more knowledge kind of on the ground there in the pastoral letter experience of 80 to 83. As Robert was saying, the pastoral letter committee begins with Bernardine and others, including both ends of the spectrum and moderate bishops, with their first meetings in 80. But right there in Detroit, there was certainly ground zero, if you will, for a lot of the reflection.
Well, I was basically an Uber before we knew there were Ubers. One of the many people picking and dropping Tom off at airports. And long before there were cell phones, so it was always interesting when flights were delayed. But what I remember so much was the consultative process that the committee used,
Mhm.
and they all were free to contact whomever they wished for feedback on it. And Tom, widely consulted with people, experts and people who were advocates, on the ground, not as well as theologians. And so I was always impressed because it reminded me of how in religious life we have grown into much more consultative interaction than hierarchical, for sure, for years, decades. And I usually don't see that in the church. So it was very encouraging to see that, and it made a difference. Frank knows it more than I. Other thing I would say about this, in the process of writing this book, I learned that he considers his participation on this committee and the publication of this document the most important thing he did in his life, has done in his life.
Well, it is historic in a lot of different levels, both in what it accomplished and what it didn't accomplish. And I think it represented a kind of inflection point in the history of the American bishops, because
right.
on the one hand, as you know, and Frank has also written about the story of Archbishop Hunthausen, who is also a strong prophetic voice for peace. It was at a time when the bishops were really engaging in a very critical way with aspects of American society, whether the economy later, or in this case with something that was crucially relevant in terms of the height of the arms race and the confrontation between Russia and the Reagan administration, and the demonstrations for a lot of concern about nuclear war. And here was the American bishops putting their stamp of approval on a document that raised deep questions about assumptions that American Catholics had made about supporting the Pentagon and the defense spending, this sort of thing. So on the one, and it was very impressive to see how Tom, who represented one end of the spectrum, he was not in the middle,
Right.
had so much influence in shaping this. Now, on the other hand, I say it's a high watermark. At that point, I think there was a kind of a decision from Rome to a certain extent that this is not the kind of role that they wanted a national bishops conference to play. And it had a lot of effect on the kind of bishops who were appointed after that, and a lot to do with why Tom Gumbleton remains an auxiliary bishop in Detroit for the rest of his career and becomes kind of sidelined. And also significant that we're 40 whatever years since then, and the bishops have never touched a project like this again. And my father, Daniel Ellsberg, someone from his work in the peace movement, he asked me, well, what are the odds are that the bishops now would take up this issue of nuclear weapons again now? And I said, 0. And he's, how can that be? They issued this document, this very important document. It's 40 years later. They were saying that deterrence was okay as long as you were working toward disarmament as a provisional thing, and then they just put that aside. And I said, well, it's not the same bishops' conference that it was back then. So
they're worried about who gets communion.
Yeah, right. Eucharistic coherence and whatever.
One could though, again, respecting everything that's been shared, and I think it's all right, spot on, but a couple things I'd like to add to this narrative around the peace pastoral, and Sue alluded to it earlier, right, when you were talking about the deeply consultative spirit, the listening, which has been a theme you've shared in this conversation from the beginning, is listening approach, which was resonating with kind of the sensus fidelium, the sense of the faithful coming out of Vatican II, and that whole shift in the model of the church. Some of the people that really challenged Tom, I got the privilege of looking at a lot of the archive material at Notre Dame on this issue, Tom's documents there, and the late great Mary Lou Kaunecki, Benedictine from Erie, just passed away quite recently. A wonderful person that Sue and I, got to meet with Tom. We went to Erie, right, Sue, on that trip.
Yep.
And we met Mary Lou, but also Joan Chittister, and the luminaries really that are the Erie Benedictines. that community, and enormous influence on Tom amongst all of many groups you could think of and people you can think of that influenced Tom. But I saw one document where Tom, in so many words, Mary Lou and Joan say, Tom, just with every ounce of your courage, don't let them, don't end up with a document that in any way blesses the U.S. government's current policy at that point, the Reagan administration, but it certainly wasn't just Republican policy, right? It was U.S. policy with regard to, as I mentioned earlier, Caspar Weinberger, and really effectively, as Raymond Hunthausen pointed out with the Trident submarine, a first strike policy, which is even going beyond the sort of the classic understanding of what nuclear deterrence would be. We're ready to hit back if you hit us, therefore mutually assured destruction. First strike really throws that into trouble. And, we had the weaponry to do so. So they're saying to Tom, come on, hold on, don't cave. And they loved him and they were close to him. So, we try to tell the story, I think, not just there, but throughout the book. I think Sue does a great job in, some of the key chapters where she has much more experience, the Central American chapters, for example, and in the church in Detroit, where Tom is always trying, to kind of really, I think the listening point is that he doesn't just listen to those who agree with him. And so he's trying to listen and then find the way to advocate, hold strong to his position, but at the same time, so for the bishops, you got to have a consensus. The other thing that you said, Robert's really important in the context is it's as a bishop, Tom's mentor is the lion, if you will, of the whole idea of a national bishops conference. And that's, of course, become Cardinal Dearden there in Detroit. And, when Dearden's star fades, of course, up come all these new bishops being selected by John Paul II, and goodbye to that whole consultative spirit. And also goodbye to the authority of a national bishops conference.
Frank.
But yeah, go ahead.
I think we see now with, not in the U.S. church, but internationally, Francis' goal and dream and work toward a synodality through the synod is exactly what we were trying, not I, but people were trying to do in Detroit under the leadership of Cardinal Dearden in '69. It's sort of encouraging, given all the negativity in the country and the world, to see the possibility of that other way of listening and learning and changing. And so I think it's the cycles of life that we don't get to pay attention to because we're too close to the year to year to year, decade. But this will out. I think this will out because the U.S. bishops are more and more, and this is really the words of Tom, irrelevant and incredible, lacking in credibility now. Not because he's pushed out, but because you can see it. Nobody pays any attention. They don't speak about things of moment as they did when Robert was saying about the letter on the economy and the pastoral letter on peace. They're talking about, they're not even having the synod on their agenda. So,
well, if we have limited time, so I want to, we've, this is sort of, we've talked about the kind of what Tom is most famous for, probably, in his contribution to the Catholic Peace Voice and the pastoral letter. And that's the Tom that I knew more or less. I met him when I was at the Catholic Worker in the late 70s. I've known him since then. And I've known him, he not only is talking about peace, but at this point he's engaging in civil disobedience and being arrested, not unusual for a bishop. But what was really new to me in this book was to discover not just that he was, had a broad kind of menu of issues in social justice that he was involved in, but the deep, persistent commitment of really walking the walk on all these different issues, whether it was labor or racism or Central America or peace in the Middle East. And then we get into this, the whole chapter of his longstanding solidarity with the LGBTQ community. And that, in fact, is like a big turning point in the book when you for a bishop to be taking this, really kind of courageous and prophetic stand. Why don't you talk a little bit about that? It's so striking and moving, I think, how that came about. The
Sue, why
chapter.
don't you take the lead on this one, since you were there on the ground? The story, of
Okay,
course, of
and you can go
Tom
into,
and his
all right.
brother.
I
Mhm.
remember shortly after he got the letter from his brother saying that he wrote to everybody in his family, I am gay. And Tom said, I just threw it down on the floor. I was so angry. This is that's the transformation that happens. And one of the key moments, of course, anytime he has an issue, he prays about it, reads about it. He reads probably 2 books a week. I mean, he loves to read. So, but in the course of when his mother in their home, he used to stop in for dinner after confirmations and talks, have a late dinner. And on their little porch, when they went out, he went out to the car, she stopped him and she said, Tom, is Dan going to hell?
His brother.
And Tom said, oh, Mom, no way. And that articulation of that has been lived out ever since. And he has counseled so many families through that message, really. But go ahead, Frank, from your.
Well, no, I mean, to pick up on what you just said, and as Robert pointed out, it opens a whole section, part 2 of the book. My brother came out, and that's the key, of course, because Tom becomes, as we say today, we talk about trying to be in solidarity with, or the sort of the current buzzword would be to be an ally. But Tom ends up being an ally. Really, the story is the courage. Tom would be the first to say this, of Tom's brother, his youngest sibling, Dan, who is the one who, think about that. This is such an important part. We learned from the example of Brian McNaught, who really started the Dignity chapter there in Detroit. He paid a price because he was a writer, a columnist for the Michigan Catholic newspaper, and effectively was fired because he came out. And this was where we start that chapter. But we quickly find out that when Tom's brother, Dan, writes a letter to the family, as you said, that's the letter that Tom throws down on the floor, but picks up, if you will, and ends up thinking about it. And then Tom ends up telling that story with some very, very important people. And Robert, you know so much more about this because your work and helping field the work of somebody like Sister Janine Gramick and Father Robert Nugent and the New Ways Ministry. Tom ends up with a whole new ministry, as you're both saying, that courses then through the balance of Tom's life for decades, and that is his solidarity with the LGBTQ plus communities, if you will, I think is a better way to put that. But that story is centered on the conversion role, if you will, of his own brother, but by no means only his own brother, Brian McNaught, and many other people that he personally meets. And there's so many things going on. There's that are happening at the very same time. But certainly that one, that topical area, I think we actually see that, not to get off point here, but in the Hunthausen story, some people in the peace movement think that it was all about, Reagan administration trying to do in this prophetic bishop. But, both of these people, both these bishops, were strong supporters of the dignity community, of LGBTQ issues. And I frankly think that was one significant area where they were sort of touching a third rail in terms of official Catholic doctrine. So sorry to go on too much here.
That theme of accompaniment is a major one, and that means not just supporting people from afar, but actually in so many different ways going out of his own comfort zone. Things that at first thought, wow, I can't go there. But then the personal relationships, are so compelling, and they take him to Guatemala, they take him to El Salvador repeatedly, and Honduras, and I even told you we didn't have room for a whole chapter on Colombia. It was just another. There's too much, but there's the Middle East, Peru. There's Haiti. Deep commitment to Haiti, So much that he even starts a clinic there, right? And the royalties for your book are going to go to that clinic.
Helps the found.
But
It's
if I may, Robert, even that, they were down there, he and the couple Catholic worker people from Philly were there doing work, solidarity work with Aristide and the
yes.
poor. And then this
President,
priest who has the soup kitchen, he said, you know, this is wonderful what you're doing, feeding all these people. And the priest said, well, we really need a clinic. And Johanna Berrigan from Philly, Catholic worker, said, well, that's what I do. I'm a nurse practitioner or a physician's assistant, one of the, and so that's how the clinic started. Again, a need, not someone from here saying, we think they should have a clinic.
Yeah,
And
right.
that after the earthquake in 210, anybody who asked me said, don't send supplies. Let the economy of Haiti regrow. Invest in money, help people you trust, but we don't want to just keep sending our stuff. We want them to be able to produce. So
and the late
development.
right, and the late Paul Farmer, recently passed away, was very influential on the point you're making about, let's really listen to what the people in a setting, in this case Haiti, what the Haitians themselves are saying they would like us to do.
And
Farmer
don't
learned
hire
that so
any
well.
non-Haitians, he said, which they didn't.
Let me jump ahead toward the end of the book where it's kind of important in this kind of last act in a way, and got him into some deeper trouble than all the solidarity with Central America or whatever. That's one thing. But when he stepped forward to show real solidarity with the victims of clergy sex abuse. And that was a line too far for some of his fellow bishops, don't you think?
Right. For Rome.
Yeah, Rome maybe. And actually it was after that he was told it was time for him to move out of the African-American parish where he'd been serving and living for many years.
Well, they made him leave, and they wouldn't. Two other parishes subsequent to his leaving St. Leo's, being removed from St. Leo's would be correct, asked if he would be their pastor, because he would go on weekends, and they'd say, sure, but, check out with the chancery. And he said, I don't think they'll let you. And they would not let him be a pastor anywhere, or even an administrator. No. Nowhere.
So you tell the story in that chapter of, and I remember talking with Tom about this a couple of times. He frequently refers to the Latin because, he's trained in canon law and certainly is much more of a linguist, by the way, than he would ever let on. I've learned about him. But in any event, the communio, Episcopal communio, and how, and the irony of that, I wonder if you could speak to that if there's time, Robert. I'd like to hear Sue say that, because it always struck me profoundly, the irony that Maida, I think at the time, maybe I'm getting my people confused, but the Archbishop there in Detroit kind of communicating, but it was really the bishops of Ohio, of course, who were upset because he testified or gave, effectively what would have been a statement, a press conference, showing, and in so doing, he revealed his own experience of having received some sexual abuse. But maybe you could speak to that story a little bit more, Sue, for a moment.
If there's time, yes. He went to Ohio in 06, January of 06, because the SNAP, the people, and that's a beautiful story of how he got involved with that through the Barbara Blaine, who's also deceased.
Survivors Network, for those abused by.
But anyway, he went to speak, and that was canceled. The hearing was canceled, even though the Ohio Senate had passed it unanimously to extend the statute of limitations. But this was the House. And so they gave a press conference instead, and he revealed this. And all the Ohio bishops called the nuncio immediately, and the ambassador effectively. And then the Cardinal Midas said to him, I heard from everybody, and you never told me, etc. And Tom, this is where Tom is stubborn. He said, I knew they would tell me I couldn't do it. And I knew it was important to do. But the letter says, he broke the communio of the bishops. Another way could be the men's club or the boys club. And when I think of this, that was in 2006, and he took a year before they got rid of him from the parish. But when you think of what damage has been done to the
Yes.
credibility and life of our church by the hierarchy till even last month with Illinois. It still goes on. And they were so worried that one bishop would speak the truth. And they still,
They said
even
a
after this
scandal.
was, pardon me?
They said the term they would use, which we all know is so ironic, and they use it all too frequently. They say such activity on your part, Tom, is scandalous.
Yes.
And of course, what was the real scandal? You know,
Yeah.
but it's called
Exactly.
scandalous. That's just so ironic. So,
But
It's
even
scandal.
after it
so.
was settled and he was removed, the spokesperson for the Archdiocese of Detroit said publicly, this was not done because of what he did in Ohio. But of course, there have been earlier statements that we can show contradict that. But it's always the cover up. It's sort of like Watergate and everything else. It's the original act is bad enough, but then the cover up makes it worse. And the church has made it totally worse.
I see that our
at the
time
bishop.
is just about over.
Sorry, Robert.
No. We only scratched the surface of this amazing book, but again, I guess that's a story that really captures something too about the difference between this kind of clerical understanding of communio and the real, kind of identity of the people of God that Bishop Gumbleton took from Vatican II and has embodied for all these decades. So I think anybody listening to this will get a sense of what's in this book and realize what an incredible life he's had. No guilty bystander. The extraordinary life of Bishop Thomas Gumbleton. I want to thank you both, Sue Sattler and Frank Fromherz.
Thank you both.
Welcome.